Today we're going to talk to Dr. Andrea Barthwell in the United States about so-called medical marijuana. Dr. Barthwell has been involved, we should probably say heavily involved, in this kind of research. And we say, welcome to Dr. Barthwell, welcome to WFAD.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to talk about this subject.
Well, I wonder if you could just tell us what this research is all about, because it has created quite a lot of interest. So could you please elaborate on this?
Yes. The American Society of Addiction Medicine, we refer to it as ASAM, commissioned a President's Action Group on the role of the physician in medical marijuana. And I co-chaired that group with Dr. Bob DuPont, who was the first head of the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the United States, and also served in two White Houses as the drug czar, as it was known at the time. The president of ASAM, the current president of ASAM, Lou Baxter, is a part of that committee. Tim Cermak out of California, and Mark Krause, who is on our public policy committee, and Petros Lavonis. And we reviewed all of the literature about marijuana and the actions that other health care provider groups had taken relative to marijuana and its potential use as medicine in order to develop a white paper to inform our board for our public policy development. So our objective was to examine the circumstances that led to the situation that we have in the United States, where states are taking actions to allow marijuana to be used by people with legitimate medical concerns and complaints, but it has created a terrible situation in those states. And we wanted to set out some recommendations to assist physicians who are coping with those issues of medical marijuana and to propose policy recommendations for consideration by the board. Our review findings indicated that in order to think clearly about the so-called medical marijuana, we have to first distinguish between the therapeutic potentials of chemicals that are found in marijuana itself and that can be delivered in a controlled dose by a non-toxic delivery system. And we acknowledge that medical marijuana, smoking, burning, and breathing a crude weed is not a safe delivery system. We also felt that we must consider that we have a drug approval process in the United States, and that drug approval process appears in the context of public health, and it should be applied not just to medical marijuana, but as it is, it applies to all medicines, particularly controlled substances. We knew, too, that we were doing our research in an environment where the United States Food and Drug Administration has recently added guidance to drug companies that work in the space of central nervous system drugs, those drugs that have psychoactive potential, and are requiring a different kind of post-marketing surveillance and even pre-marketing setup to mitigate the risk of marketing these drugs. And so at a time when we are putting tighter controls on availability and access of psychoactive substances, since in the United States, prescription drug abuse is the fastest rising kind of drug abuse that we're experiencing, we also wanted to make sure that any consideration that we gave to making marijuana available to patients would recognize these more rigid controls that the Food and Drug Administration was placing on all psychoactive substances.
Mm-hmm.
So what we concluded is that cannabis-based medicines, or cannabinoid medications, those that interact with the cannabinoid system in the brain and throughout the body, should be subjected to the scrutiny of the Food and Drug Administration, and that it is possible to standardize them and submit them to the kinds of tests that the Food and Drug Administration requires for all other medications, and that when those medications are approved, they should be accompanied by adequate directions that the physician can use to apply them to approved medical indications. And while we know a lot about the risk of marijuana use, we don't know as much about the benefits, even though there are a number of studies that have taken place with smoked cannabis. They don't meet the stage 2 and stage 3 clinical trial requirements that other medications meet. And so that at best, we know that there's something worth researching in the cannabinoid system, but that we have not clearly defined what that is. So we are not prepared to have physicians advise patients on the use of these materials.
How come that the Food and Drug Administration on their own has not initiated this process to allow, potentially, use of marijuana as medicine? How come?
Well, the Food and Drug Administration is not an agency that initiates work. It reviews the work and makes a determination as to whether something can go on the market. So we do have Marinol that we use in this country, and it is a synthetic form of THC. So the molecule is standardized and characterized. And our National Cancer Institute asked that research be done on marijuana when the serendipitous observation that people who smoked weed got the munchies came to their attention. And as a result of that serendipitous discovery and the efforts on the part of the National Cancer Institute in the United States, NIDA and the National Cancer Institute teamed up, did all of the preclinical and clinical work that was required to develop the synthetic THC and bring it to the marketplace. It then went through a review with the FDA, and a review of a drug that has a psychoactive component to it is, at the same time it's reviewed by the FDA, is reviewed by the DEA for their scheduling recommendation. The Marinol came on the market decades ago as a Schedule II drug, and it's been downgraded to a Schedule III drug because it just is not subjected to the same abuse that we have seen for crude marijuana in this country. So a number of marijuana advocates would say that nothing that interacts with the cannabinoid receptor can get a fair shake in the United States, and that's clearly untrue because an action to downgrade THC was taken to make it more readily available for physicians for prescribing.
So what do you think now when you have done the work that you've done together with your colleagues, what do you think will be the outcome or the result of the work that you've done? Will that influence anything, do you think, in the U.S. policy on so-called medical marijuana?
Well, we hope that it will. What our paper sets forth is that in order to think clearly about medical marijuana, you must first distinguish between the therapeutic potential of those chemicals and smoked marijuana. And we know that if any of the components of marijuana are ever shown to be beneficial to treat any illness, we are going to need to have a non-toxic route of administration, a controlled dose, and a closed access system whereby a company prepares a product. That product is standardized in its composition. That composition is known. It moves through a distribution system to a pharmacy, and the patient gets that medicine from a pharmacy and not a street vendor. And we as physicians will require that. What we hope will happen as a result of our action is that the members of the American Society of Addiction Medicine will heed our advice and the recommendations, which is to not catch themselves up in what's going on at the state and local level by giving patients who have medical conditions an affirmative defense for having marijuana. So it's not that doctors are prescribing this, but that by certifying that that person has a condition for which they could use marijuana, it suggests that the physician believes that there's enough evidence to support that. So we think that that is a terrible position to be in as a physician, and we have information from malpractice insurers who say that they will not indemnify a physician against a claim if something untoward happens as a result of making that recommendation. And so we want physicians not to put themselves in that untenable position and to really reject responsibility for providing access to cannabis until such time that these materials receive marketing approval from the FDA. So our hope is that our physicians in ASAM adopt that, and that we are working aggressively now to work with other medical societies and associations to make them aware of our position and provide to them the information that they need so that they recommend the same to their physician members. And then finally, one of the first things that we're going to do with this is during our legislative days in April, take our white paper to members of Congress to make sure that they understand that not all medical societies support this, and we certainly not only don't support it, we're actually calling for this someone to push back on this, both at the state and the federal level.
Thank you, Dr. Barthwell, for taking the opportunity to, not opportunity only, but time to talk to us. And there is probably a reason to get back to you later this year to find out how this investigation that you've done, the research that you've done, will be followed up by politicians and others. But thank you very much for talking to us.